Welcome to Keeping Current, an ERS and HVM podcast designed to plug you into the world of electrical power systems. I'm your host, Joe Dwyer, and whether you're an industry professional or simply fascinated by the advancements in engineering, this podcast is for you. Each episode, we bring you expert insights, real world experiences, and the best practices you need to stay current in regarding electrical power. Today, we will explore the evolution of the electrical industry and how safety began to be a central focus starting in the 1970s. Joining us for the discussion is my good friend Greg Smith, the ERS VP of Sales and Services, with more than 20 years of experience in the field driving engineering, services, and markets. Today, Greg and I will be exploring the development of electrical safety, the responsibility of driving regulations and standards, current challenges that the industry is facing today, obviously, and the future of electrification. So get ready to unplug and connect. And again, good to see you, Greg. Welcome.
Hey, thanks, Joe. You and I go way back, actually, if you remember correctly, when I first started at HBM. Did a lot of this type of work in the industry. We've seen a lot of change, certainly throughout that time period. And I'm really honored to be a part of the first inaugural version of this podcast. Thanks for asking me to be on. I'm looking forward to the conversation and maybe revisiting some of that history and talking about where we've come, right? From the times that you and I were running around Ohio together back in the mid 2000s.
Yep, I remember those days very well. We partnered up, Greg, to try to help manage the risk of various clients in various industries in the Ohio Valley. That was our main focus. And I think we did a very good job doing that. Moving forward, we can try to recognize our mistakes, our successes, in tune with that. Can you try to help us, maybe walk us through the evolution of the industry and how did it start for our company and others like us, trying to help us working with various industries regarding safety?
Yeah, that sounds great, Joe. As you mentioned, I've got about 20 years of experience in this particular industry, and I've certainly seen a lot of change over that time. But when you look at organizations like ours, like ERS and HBM and others in the business, those organizations were actually established, long before that. Many of them started back in the 1970s, some even earlier. And during that time period, there was a need from customers for us to have organizations that could go out and help them maintain and service their electrical distribution systems. That's really where this industry began. And a lot of those organizations were smaller, local regional companies that were out there servicing their local clientele. Right. And I give a lot of credit to the original founders of those organizations. In our case, ERS, the current organization that I'm a part of, as well as HBM, they're actually a conglomerate of acquisitions that occurred throughout time in the 90s. But the original founding companies, High Voltage Maintenance out of Dayton, and ETI, which was based at the time out of Pleasanton, California, those founders, as well as other organizations that were throughout the United States, locally and regionally, saw that there needed to be some standardization to the business itself. And at the time, that was more focused on electrical testing and maintenance. So those founding fathers came together of those organizations and basically established what is today known as the International Electrical Testing Association, or NETA. And the purpose of that was those groups, even though you could have, I guess, viewed them as competitors back in the day, they wanted to create standards with which services were provided on large-scale electrical distribution systems. And they also wanted to create a workflow process that allowed the people that were doing that work to be able to be qualified into steps as far as how certified that they were on their ability to service different types of pieces of equipment. So when they established the International Electrical Testing Association, as an example, they created the standards that are now driving the industry. I think it's understood that the NETA acceptance testing and maintenance standards are in many ways the de facto regulations around how to maintain equipment when it comes to electrical distribution systems. And And then in addition to that, they put forth a very detailed process in order to obtain certain levels of certification as a field engineer, which is now known as NETA certification. And so it was really interesting that those founding fathers back then came together to make that happen. And then what they did was they worked throughout time to try to drive standardization of those and acceptance of those types of services throughout the industry. In addition to that, over time, what was being found out was the electrical safety needed to have a lot of improvement. I think if you go back to the 1970s, 1980s, 1990s, safety and electrical safety in particular probably didn't have the standardization of processes, et cetera, that they do now. And so
Right.
not only did
Right.
the NETA organization take on the standardization of the testing side of the business, but they also started to participate very heavily in helping drive the safety standards that we have in place today that you and I were trying to help customers with back in the early 2000s.
Great analysis, Greg. As I started out in the industry, in the Air Force, and then in the private sector, the things that we took for granted or we thought that we didn't need to adhere to, nobody bothered with. But as evolution and better ways of managing the risk, seeing what works, what doesn't, things have changed dramatically. So, what we have to address is, well, things are changing and they're always changing. So, who is responsible for driving these regulations? And then on part of that is, how do companies grow while having to adhere to these standards and managing their risk? Because, managing your risks and making sure that your workers are safe is a large commitment of a company. So, how do we go about doing that?
Yeah, that's a great question, Joe. So we obviously talked, I just talked about the NETA standards, which are a great guide for
Yeah, yeah,
organizations, right, in regards to what I'll call task-oriented procedures on how to maintain and also commission new electrical distribution systems. But there's also additional regulations in the marketplace that are driving safe working atmospheres, safety, especially electrical safety in the workplace, and also to some levels, even beyond the tactical side of maintaining equipment, but systematically maintaining that equipment. In particular, one of the organizations that's been heavily involved in that is the National Fire Protection Agency.
right.
So the National Fire Protection Agency originally developed, they're the ones that have established the National Electric Code, right, which is the guide to everything that we do in the United States from a construction perspective, et cetera, in regards to electricity. And what they did was they started to create subdivisions of that standard, such as the NFPA 70E standard, which is the one, Joe, like you and I were out trying to drive early on in its
Yes, yes,
implementation, right?
yes, yes.
And the 70E standard is a regulation around electrical safety in an effort to try to prevent arc flash burns and also electrical shock. And
Right.
so tremendous amount of change has occurred in that particular standard in particular over the last couple of decades. It went from its infancy where it was a standard that needed to get some acceptance and people needed to understand more about it, to where it is today, which is a lot more teeth involved into the requirements to meet that regulation, as well as a much higher acceptance rate on that. And essentially, it's basically become a de facto standard when you're building new facilities and operating existing facilities. The next version of that, Joe, that we're starting to see is in regards to the NFPA 70B standard. That's B as in boy.
Yeah.
That that standard's been around for a while, and it certainly has been a guide in regards to how to create a plan to maintain your facilities, and that has been in existence. But I think we've seen a tremendous amount of change in that standard here in the last several years. It's becoming more and more important that you make sure that your equipment is operating properly, because even some of the other components of the other standards, like the 70E standard, are based on good, proper operation of the equipment themselves.
Yeah.
So if the equipment doesn't operate properly, some of the engineering assumptions that you may need to make on the 70E analysis that are required aren't applicable. So
Right.
what the National Fire Protection Agency has done is it's certainly put a lot more teeth into the standard regarding requirements or organization around planning and then performing the tasks associated with maintaining that equipment, which are similar and aligned to the NETA testing standard. And then
Yeah. Yeah.
in addition to that, Joe, what we're seeing is we're seeing the regulatory bodies really start to embrace those regulations and start to enforce them. And when I say regulatory bodies, I'm talking groups like OSHA, which obviously has a lot of pull in the United States.
Yep.
They're obviously the de facto health and safety advisor for industry in the U.S. And then also the authorities that have jurisdiction, or the AHJs, in
Yeah.
certain areas. They're becoming much more knowledgeable on things like these NFPA regulations, and they're driving the implementation of these in the customer bases across the country.
One of the things I like about the 70B is that it changed from a suggestion to, or suggested guideline, to now a standard as just recently as 2023. So, like you said, now we have some teeth to it. But what it also allows is a variety of aspects aside from just doing maintenance by doing an initial equipment inspection, doing fixes, and getting the equipment back up to standards, maintaining a predictive and preventive maintenance program with assigned tasks. It also increases worker safety, which we're all trying to make sure is paramount at the end of the day, obviously.
Yeah, I agree. I think some of those changes that you're describing are what customers are struggling with today, right? How do
Yeah.
I implement these? What do I need to do? Because they are new, right? And this
Yeah.
is very similar to what we encountered back in the 2000s in regards to the NFPA 70E standard. It was
Hmm.
wasn't that customers didn't want to adhere; they didn't necessarily know how to
Yeah.
exactly, and what they needed to do. Now, I know on future podcasts, I believe you're going to be going into more detail around those standards themselves,
Yes.
talking about a
Yes.
little bit more of the information that has changed, and get into more of those details. That's probably an entire call in and of itself.
Yeah.
But it is one of the things that is driving a lot of questions in the industry, and is causing customers to think about what is the way that they're approaching these programs today, and what might they need to do to change that approach to move forward into the future with some of the
Mhm.
changes that have been coming up in these regulations.
Right. I think you answered my last thought is, how, what does the future hold for the electrical industry? And I think you nailed it, when we discuss compliance, adherence to standards, worker safety, protective equipment, it's like a new culture being formed, and incrementally each year, we get a little better, or each, every 3 years at each new standard, we get a little better, a little more understanding of how to work safely and as well as maintain our equipment. I think you nailed it right on the head, Greg.
Yeah, I think that we've come a long way, and I really believe the changes are all positive. I think it's just a matter of educating ourselves
Mhm.
around what those changing regulations are. They've certainly created a better workplace from a safety perspective,
Yes.
and I also believe they're going to and are starting to create a more reliable electrical grid and electrical system
Yeah.
for us in general. And Joe, that's going to be really important because there's a lot of things going on right now in the electrical industry that are putting some strains on
Hmm.
quite a bit of the electrical capacity of the United States. We
Right.
have we have a lot of new construction happening here in the U.S. Now, what are the drivers of that? There's certainly some buzzwords that I think everyone's familiar with. The leading one of the leading ones is artificial intelligence, right?
Right.
That's something that you hear all the time on the news and in the media. And it is something that is definitely in its early infancy and is expanding dramatically. Well, in order for us to be able to handle the artificial technology or intelligence capabilities, it requires a significant amount of power to operate those units, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that's putting a lot of constraint on the existing power grid because, as everyone's probably aware, there's been a lot of changes in the power grid and the utility industry in general as well. When we first started, Joe, and I think you might even have a background in this, but we were heavily involved in applications for utilities like coal, natural gas, right? Those
Yeah.
were all the ways with which our base power load was being generated. Well, a lot of that has changed because of environmental regulations, et cetera. It's difficult to build a gas facility or a coal power plant, for example, in the United States. So we're seeing this additional requirement for power capacity due to things like artificial intelligence. Yet we are having a more difficult time creating this large baseload utility generation service. So what's happening is we're having to move to alternative ways to generate energy, right?
Mm-hmm.
Such as battery energy storage, renewable energy, and who knows what else the future could lie, right? In
Yeah.
regards to electrical power generation. And what that's requiring people to start thinking about is if I'm going to go build a big new facility, I've got to take real strong consideration of how I'm going to get my power, right?
Right.
And in some
Right.
cases, we are seeing customers that are actually bringing their own power to their application because there simply isn't enough to help support their capacity on their capital requirements. You know,
Sure. Sure.
um, and then when you add into that not just artificial intelligence, which obviously some of the very large hyperscale data centers are driving, but you add in the re-electrification of the United States. During COVID, the supply chain issues that were caused a major concern for the manufacturing world in general, especially in the United States, right? So organizations have started to rethink the way that they have their supply chain set up. And you're certainly starting to see more and more of that come back into the United States. And we're seeing additional manufacturing capability being constructed within the semiconductor industry, the automotive industry, certainly in regards to electrical vehicles. Well, every
Yeah.
one of those facilities is requiring power, right? And that power has to come from somewhere and it has to be distributed in some fashion. And now what's happening is that our entire electric grid grows. You also need people and talent to be able
Right.
to support
Yeah.
that.
Yep.
And that puts a strain on the overall industry in general. And we are definitely starting to see that. So there's a tremendous opportunity right now for people in general who are looking for maybe a new career or a new path. The electrical industry is really a booming industry right now. And the reality is, from a support perspective, the demand is outweighing the supply, right? So there is a
Right.
lot of opportunity for people in the engineering field, in the field of construction, the fields like ours, but all the support services around electrical distribution and electrical power are in great need right now. And there's great opportunity for people who want to look at a really fun career and one like you and I have made over the last couple decades.
Yeah. Well, I started out after I left the Air Force. I started out in the geothermal power industry. I was part of a team of 125 megawatt geothermal power. So that just totally backs up what you were saying. We're having to find new ways of providing power. Solar is big now. Geothermal is getting larger. Wind. So, but you're hitting the point. We need people in the ranks to move up, and finding those people is getting more and more difficult. So, great point, Greg. Really appreciate that. Do you have any final words of wisdom as we wrap up this podcast?
Yeah, I think, Joe, as all the constraints that we've talked about are approaching us right now with all of the new construction projects and the re-electrification of America, et cetera, yeah, it's going to bring in and require us to create new talent in the industry, which creates a tremendous opportunity for people to take advantage of this growing marketplace. And during that, I think these standards are going to play a real critical part in allowing those new industry people, as well as the people that are already in the industry, to be able to expand their technical knowledge, create a more quality product, and also work safely. So I'm really looking forward to seeing how these continue to evolve and grow. And it's such an exciting time for this industry. I'm really looking forward to see the next 20 years how all of this progresses as we've witnessed over the last couple of decades. Thanks for having me on, Joe. Really happy to be a part of the first one of these, and I look forward to seeing where this podcast goes in the future.
Well, excellent. Thanks, Greg. That's it for this episode of Keeping Current. I hope you found our discussion on the foundation and evolution of electrical industry insightful. If you enjoyed this episode, please be sure to subscribe, rate, and leave a review. We really do appreciate it. And don't forget to tune in every other Thursday for more expert knowledge and industry updates. You can also connect with us on LinkedIn to join the conversation and stay updated on the latest episodes. Thanks for listening, and until then, keep current.